Welcome back to the Metal Exchange. Justin and Chris here with you for another episode. And this week we do Blind Guardian's Imagination from the Other Side, celebrating a 25th anniversary with a re-release. But before we get to that, Bud, how are you, man?
Good. How was your holiday?
Good. It was really, really nice, relaxing. Sort of, but it was different than most years. I think I speak for everybody when I say I look forward to returning to some semblance of normalcy in 2021.
Yeah, no doubt about it.
Have you? I believe we had talked offline. You had the chance to listen to the new Ronnie Atkins single, "Real."
Yeah, it was great. So Ronnie Atkins is the longtime singer of the band Pretty Maids, and he has fallen under poor health. Unfortunately, he had a cancer scare. He came out of it, was in remission, and now it's back. And they're telling him that it's I'm fairly certain they told him that it was going to be terminal, and he had never had any plans to make a solo album in his career, but I think what's going on in his life now has caused him to kind of reassess that decision. So he put out a new single. What was the name of the single? Please refresh.
It was I believe it was called "Real." It was
yes.
Yeah.
Just if you're a fan of Pretty Maids and Ronnie's voice from Avantasia, definitely just give it a listen. It's just pretty solid melodic hard rock, I would say, melodic metal, in the vein of what you'd probably hear Pretty Maids do, but a little bit more stripped down.
And what's interesting is I had no idea, and I'm sure we'll get into this a little bit more. He actually does backing vocals on Imaginations from the Other Side. So I thought it was kind of timely to talk about his new release. And I think that if we ever do a long form Pretty Maids episode, we can go into more detail. But you have a pretty funny Ronnie Atkins story from when you met him a couple of years ago. Do you remember that?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll never forget it. I had really not been very aware of Pretty Maids, even though they had been around since the early 80s. And when they were announced to play at Prog Power USA, I started listening to them, trying to get myself familiar with them. And I ended up becoming a huge fan. I don't know how that band passed me by for as long as it did, but by the time Prog Power rolled around, it was the set I was most excited for. I had such a blast watching them. I was standing right next to you, as a matter of fact, and that was just such a cool set. And afterwards, we were in the hotel courtyard, and you ran up to me, and you're like, Rodney Atkins is just sitting down at one of the high top tables outside and just talking to people. And so I just got on this line of people, and I went up to him and I was like, "Hey, Ronnie, I'm a new fan of the band, but man, I've just become such a huge fan." And he was like, "Oh, that's great." And he opened up his arms like he was gonna hug me. So I was like, all right. So I gave him a hug, and the dude kissed me right on the cheek. And I go back over to you, and you're like, "Did Ronnie Atkins just kiss you?" I'm like, "Yeah, I think he did. I'm never gonna wash this face again," and I haven't.
I have such vivid memories of that. Well, I'd say night, but I think it was probably 3:00 in the morning by that point. But I have such vivid memories of that. And I was just so upset when I heard that he had gotten sick, and it seemed like he had kicked out, but he may have gotten some more bad news. But he was just the nicest guy, and I think he was just so humbled to be in the United States and playing for the American audience, and then obviously to hear that people were still discovering his stuff and his music, which was obviously really touching for him. He was a really nice guy, and that's something that I'll never forget. And you haven't washed your face in probably about 7 or 8 years now, so that says everything you need to know right there.
Yeah, I'm amazed that anybody even wants to come near me these days.
A couple of other things I just wanted to mention. 2 other bands that released some pretty interesting stuff. There's a band out of Brazil called Daydream 11. They're a heavier progressive metal band. They just released their new single. It's called Poison, from an album that's due out early next year, I believe. Really, really excited to hear these guys play again. I hadn't heard any new material from them in a couple of years, so I was excited to hear that. We'll post a link. we'll post a link to the band, in the comments section. And another band that I thought was interesting was a melodic death metal band out of Croatia called Inceptor. They had released a music video for an album called, or I should say, a song called Golden Throne last month, and they have an album that's, I believe, just came out called Universe. Really, really interesting stuff. Typical melodic death metal with Cookie Monster vocals, but it's well done. And if you go to their YouTube page, they've actually done a number of other covers, and they run the gamut. They've done Amorphous, Symphony X, Carcass. I mean, like all over the place. But these guys clearly have some talent, and I look forward to hearing from them in the near future. So just a couple of things that I wanted to talk about before we get into Imaginations. But with that said, let's get into the reason why we're here. Imaginations from the Other Side. It came out in 1995. I believe it was June of 1995 when it actually was released, or April of 95. I'm sorry, April of 95 that it was actually released. And we're celebrating a 25th anniversary for this album. Do you remember when you first heard it, or I guess when you first heard Blind Guardian in general?
Yeah, so this was one of those albums that just passed me by for a long time. My first Blind Guardian album was Nightfall in Middle Earth, which I just kind of bought on a whim. I think I had seen it just in a store, and I was just like, oh, I'll just, give this a whirl, because, Blind Guardian was a fairly well-known band in the power metal realm, and I had heard Hansi do guest vocals with Ed Guy on their Vainglory Opera album. So they were kind of a grower for me. I didn't love the album at first just because his vocals were just so unique, but like I just couldn't grab onto it right away. I hear a lot of people say the same thing about when they hear Geddy Lee from Rush. They're just like, you either love him or you hate him, I guess. And it took me some time, but I really grew to love Hansi's vocals. So from there, I picked up Somewhere Far Beyond. And so this Imaginations album kind of nestles right in between those two. It's kind of like a really impressive 3 albums in a row, just 3 really, really strong albums. It wasn't until Blind Guardian announced that they were going to be playing this album in its entirety at Prog Power USA. Once again, talking about Prog Power. And once again, knowing that I was going to hear it, I went back and I listened to the album a few times, and I felt pretty sheepish for waiting as long as I did to listen to it, because it's really a fantastic album. And when it was announced, I was just kind of like, oh, like, it couldn't have been Nightfall, or it couldn't have been Somewhere Far Beyond. And now in retrospect, I'm so glad that they ended up playing this album, because it was one of the best sets I ever got to see at Center Stage in Atlanta. Just fantastic start to finish.
I had a very similar experience. I first heard them in the late 90s when I bought Nightfall and Middle Earth. And it was one of those bands that was kind of lumped into the German power metal scene with a Gamma Ray or a Helloween. And I just figured, being a huge fan of both of those bands, this was like the next logical, extension of, that German power metal. And I first heard Nightfall, and obviously the Tolkien lyrics that are, kind of prevalent throughout their entire catalog, really. But the story that Nightfall was telling, I thought it was really, really unique, but very, very well done. And I think that while there are some filler tracks on that album, that to me was always the pinnacle for Nightwish at the time in the late 90s. And I just, songs like Mirror Mirror and Nightfall were just stuff that I just listened to on repeat, back in late 1998, 1999. And I liked the sound. And obviously you mentioned Hansi's vocals, which were very, very unique. I was not used to hearing that almost like thrashy power metal, almost like a Walls of Jericho type sound. From another German band at the time, because I think that, bands like Helloween and Gamma Ray kind of polished up their sound over the years, whereas Blind Guardian was still pretty crunchy and thrashy, even in the late 90s. But I bring that up because I too listened to Somewhere Far Beyond as my second Blind Guardian album, and that another album with just some fantastic tracks. I kind of skipped over this album as well, but the first time I remember hearing a lot of songs from it was back in 2002 when I saw them live. Actually, at their first North American show at the Prague Power Festival, they had never played, and I was surprised to hear this. They had never played a U.S. show before, but they headlined that festival, and they were one of the reasons that I went down to Atlanta, but admittedly not the number one reason, and quite frankly, probably not the fourth or fifth reason. That show had bands like Angra doing their first American show, Gamma Ray, Pain of Salvation, Threshold. I mean, these were bands that I was a huge fan of in the late 90s and early 2000s. Blind Guardian was almost the cherry on top for me to get me down to Atlanta. But when they played the show, they actually wound up playing, I think, 5 songs from Imaginations during their headlining set. And that was my first exposure to this album, hearing it in a live setting, and it was fantastic. I don't recall if you saw. I know you were at the show. I don't remember if you saw that set, but what a fantastic job they did.
Yeah, I actually didn't see the set, but I heard the entire thing. I was actually outside. So this was back when at Center Stage they didn't have the vendor room, and everyone was just in the lobby, I guess you would call it, of the venue where the bars were. The merch guys were selling their CDs right there. It was like really crowded. Like there was just tables of people selling CDs and people walking around. It was really tight. And I remember I was just standing at the bar talking to somebody, just having like a long-winded conversation about whatever. And I heard the whole set from right next to the door, and it was just like amazing. It sounded so good. And I wasn't really even a big fan of the band yet at the time. But yeah, I definitely remember just hearing it right next to the door, like the whole set, but never actually like went inside to see what was going on. Was just listening, just because, like you said, there were so many other bands that were a priority for me, including Edguy, who I don't think you mentioned earlier.
Oh yeah, how could I forget? I mean,
Yeah.
they were at the top of the list as well. It's I mean, what a lineup that was. But this like I said, my first exposure to songs like A Past and Future Secret, Bright Eyes, Imaginations, the title track, Mordred Song, the script for my Requiem, and that was all nestled in between a bunch of songs from Nightfall, Somewhere Far Beyond, The Night at the Opera. I mean, they really hit everything up until that point for this show, and it was my first real exposure, and I couldn't believe how tight they were. And Hansi's vocals live, it was like listening to him on the albums. It was that impressive, and it was something that stuck with me. And it's funny, even to this day, and we'll get into the album in a second, but even to this day, one of the best live bands around, and a band that I never miss, or I try not to miss when they're touring. But by the same token, I don't listen to a lot of Blind Guardian on disc, even to this day. And I'm not sure why, because whenever I listen to it, I wind up just falling in love again for the first time. But I haven't listened to this album in its entirety in years, or any Blind Guardian album for that matter, just because I don't know. I'm embarrassed to say I feel like it's something that I should be listening to more because I love it, but it's something I just always pass over for something else. I don't know why.
I feel like an album like this is kind of a victim, at least from on a personal level, of becoming a metal fan like later into a band's existence. Because like for me, like I started listening to metal in 1997, and by that point, Blind Guardian had already had a number of albums. So, you're playing catch up at that point. And there's so many bands, you're like,
right. You have new power metal bands that are coming out
right
at that time.
So
Sonata Arctica, Rhapsody, all these bands are coming out with their first album. And then to go back was kind of like, like you said, it's a victim of the fact that they were so experienced and had so many albums at this point.
And I'm going back and I'm listening to all the old Halloween albums and all the old Sabotage albums. And we're teenagers and we only have so much money and we only have so much time. And there's no Spotify, there's no YouTube, so it's just a matter of if you can get your hands on a disc. So again, like this just happens to be one of those things that I guess for both of us fell through the cracks because maybe somebody said you're going to want to listen to Somewhere Far Beyond, and so you grab that first or whatever. Um, and like you said, there's new things coming out, and like I had grabbed Nightfall in Middle Earth when it came out in 1998, because at that point I was a metal fan. So maybe I would have gotten Imaginations, but Nightfall just came out, so went with that instead. And I think I even had Night at the Opera on disc before I even like listened to Imaginations all the way through. So I mean, it just again was just one of
Timing
those.
more than anything else,
Yeah,
yes.
for sure. Like, if we had become fans in the early 90s, then we probably would have just grabbed this album when it came out in 95, but it just didn't happen to work out that way.
Yeah, it's timing more than anything else. What's interesting is the lineup on this album is almost the same as the lineup currently, and by that I mean Hansi's unique vocal style on top of the music, and he and Andre, the guitar player, Andre Olbrich, they write all the songs, right? And Andre is still with the band. And honestly, one of the things that stood out to me on this particular disc, maybe even more so than any of their older releases, he is such an underrated guitar player. My God, the guy is so talented, and his leads are unlike any other band. And when I say that, it's because when he does a guitar solo, it's an Andre Olbrich guitar solo, and that's on almost every track on this album.
I definitely noticed that even though this album came out in 1995, there were definitely parts of it that harkened back to the very early speed metal days of Blind Guardian. And a lot of that is in that guitar work.
Yes.
It's kind of cool, because it's kind of like this album kind of is almost like a bridge between the older sound of Blind Guardian and them becoming a little bit more mature as far as like adding more orchestrations and making the music a little more dramatic, but while keeping kind of that folksy element to it.
Yeah, I agree. Just rounding out the lineup, and I'm going to butcher the names, but Marcus Sipin, the guitar player, he plays all the rhythm guitars, still with the band. And the only guy who's no longer with the band is Toman Stouch, the drummer. But interestingly enough, it was not long after Nightfall came out, a couple of years after Imaginations, when he started his own band, Savage Circus. And if you haven't heard Savage Circus, picture Imaginations from the other side, just reincarnated with basically a who's who of power metal, in that band. And when I say that, they only released 2 albums: Toman on drums, Thorsten Hain on guitar, Jens Carlson on vocals, who is probably the closest thing to Hansi in the world of metal, just because his vocals are, I mean, you hate to say it, but he's a Hansi clone. And then you had Pete Slick from Iron Savior on guitars and on bass. And back at some point, I think Mike Tirana was even playing drums for these guys. The 2 Savage Circus discs, Dreamland Manor, which came out in 2005, and then in 2009 of Doom and Death. These albums are literally Imaginations from the Other Side, part 2 and 3, as far as I'm concerned.
It's kind of hard to argue it. I remember the first time I heard them, I thought it was Blind Guardian.
Yeah, it's that close. So if you haven't, and we'll post a link this week, definitely check out some of this Savage Circus material. It still holds up, and Dreamland Manor is the best Blind Guardian album that you've never heard. It's that good. And just while we're on the tangent, Jens Carlson's work with Persuader also has such a heavy Blind Guardian vibe to it. And then there's a band out of Germany called Solar Fragment, which also had 2 albums in the 2000s. Spark of Deity in 2007, In Our Hands in 2011, another Blind Guardian clone, just because of how I guess unique that the Blind Guardian style is, that you have other bands that come out that are very, very similar in style. Both recommended, both highly unique bands, in the genre, but really, really good stuff and worth checking out. When you listen to this album again, and I know that you obviously saw the whole thing live a couple of years ago, do any songs really stand out for you more than others, or tell me a little bit about that? What songs stick out to you on this disc?
For me, I mean, I love how the album just starts out like like just raring to go. Like you just hear like those orchestrations start out and the guitars come in and it's like, let's just get going. There's not like a, your 2-minute like orchestral symphonic intro that a lot of power metal albums would have. Like it's just, let's just jump in there. So the title track 1, Imaginations from the Other Side, is a highlight for me. I'm Alive is track 2. I mean, I don't know that there's not even like a mediocre song on this album to me. Like every song is awesome. I love A Past and Future Secret is such a cool, like folky kind of ballad. The script for My Requiem is just it's just a banger of a song, just like start to finish. Mordred's song is super, super cool. Born in a Morning Hall is another. Like I'm just going down the list one after the other. Every song to me is really good. I'm a fan of the whole album.
I would argue it's their most complete album, and by that I mean some people are partial to Nightfall because of the concept and everything else, and some of the fans of the earlier speed metal stuff, and I totally get it. There's some amazing tracks when you go deeper into the discography, but this album I think is their most complete album, where when you play it from beginning to end, you just come away and you're shocked at everything came together in my mind for this album. And I'll mention a couple of things in particular for me, and I'll take it right now. My track of the week is I'm Alive. I forgot how awesome this song is. You want to talk about a banger. It's the second song on the disc. It's right after the title track, which is the longest song on the album at over 7 minutes. But the opening riff to I'm Alive after the acoustic guitar intro, which is phenomenal. My God. I mean, you want to talk about a heavy, thrashy power metal song. I'm Alive is it for me. I love that song, and I think it's probably one of the most underrated songs in the entire catalog.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It's just a fantastic song, and again, like hearing this whole album played live in its entirety. They did. I remember they did like a couple of songs from different albums and a couple of new songs, maybe three or four. Then they played all of Imaginations, and then they did maybe three or four additional tracks at the end, including a Bard song, which is always like a fun live sing along with the crowd. But yeah, I'm Alive was definitely. I mean, it was so funny because like the two times that Blind Guardian played at Prague Power, um, the one time I was standing on one side of the door, and the other time I was standing on the other side of the door, and this time I was just standing right on the inside of the venue, but right next to the door, and I was just leaning up against the wall, and I just was standing there with my friend Knops, and I just would just like I'd have a beer in my hand, and when I finished my beer, one of us would go right over to the bar, get another one, come back in, and I had the best time just standing there and watching Blind Guardian just kill it live. The crowd, the whole venue was packed. It was a Thursday night. They were the headline band. The venue was packed to the gills. They were hanging from the rafters, as Gorilla Monsoon would say, and it was just like incredible. It's just, and that was probably the first time I actually visually saw Blind Guardian play it in a full set, and I was absolutely blown away. And every song from this album came across just fantastically live. It was really it was just an unbelievable experience and something that I will always remember.
I couldn't agree more. Every time I hear these songs, even today, I just live. I think they're outstanding and somehow even better than on the disc itself. You know, it's funny you mentioned Gorilla Monsoon. I remember seeing Blind Guardian play at the old WWF restaurant in Times Square, which is no longer there. But you want to talk about a double bill? Symphony X opening for Blind Guardian, and you would say to yourself, how could these two bands be on the same bill? I don't know. I have absolutely no idea, but I remember that show being fantastic. And that was around what, I guess 2002 or 2003, somewhere in that neighborhood. And they just put on the best show. And every time I leave a Blind Guardian show, I listen to nothing but Blind Guardian for like a week and a half or 2 weeks. And then, like I said, I kind of don't listen to them for a while, but every time I jump in, I'm like all in. You know, it's I'm not dipping my toe in the Blind Guardian pool. I'm jumping, you know, face first. That's how good this stuff is, to hear it, you know, every now and again.
Yeah, I think it's worth mentioning too that like they haven't stopped being great. Like all their new releases are excellent. It's not like they've kind of lost any steam coming into the 21st century. I mean, they're still releasing fantastic album after fantastic album. Their last album was like a 2-disc, or like it's an orchestrated Blind Guardian album. I mean, are there even any like electric guitars on the entire album? I don't think so. It's all just
that's right, just the orchestration. I know that we had a mutual friend that absolutely, I think it might have been his album of the year when it came out. He loved it so much.
It was like listening to like a Hollywood soundtrack, like a soundtrack to like a Lord of the Rings or something like that.
That's right. And it was just they see, and you have they don't, unlike other bands, they're not releasing album after album after album every year. They seem to meticulously write this stuff and then release an album every 3 or 4 years, but it works for them. And that's why I think that there's something there where they're just not pumping out material to get it out there. They take their time. They tour around each album. I mean, they've headlined Wacken, so you know that they're playing in front of large crowds, and they're just becoming more and more successful with every release. It just it seems like they're not in their heyday, but they're just beginning to hit their stride in a number of ways.
No doubt, and I just would highly recommend their live DVD, which they wanted the DVD to be perfect, so they booked the venue and had like a Blind Guardian festival, and they headlined their own festival with the idea that they wanted to film a DVD and have it come out exactly the way they wanted it to come out. It's called Imaginations Through the Looking Glass, and it came out in 2004. It's awesome. I highly recommend it. I'm a big fan of concert DVDs and Blu-rays, and it's definitely worth watching them play in front of this massive crowd. And it's literally called Blind Guardian Fest, and it took place in Germany. And the band played 2 nights, so I think they recorded parts from both nights. So it literally says on Wikipedia the band intended to record a DVD since early 1998. However, due to their high requirements, no existing metal festival had been considered suitable. So
Yeah, that tells you everything you need to know,
yeah,
right?
you want to talk about a band that wanted to do things right. That they did. It was 20 songs. It's over 2 hours of music. There's a second disc with a bunch of bonus stuff on it. I give it the highest recommendation. It is, as far as like live DVDs go, it's so cool. Like
It's
it's like
funny you
watching
mentioned that.
it's like watching a Wacken kind of style festival with just a massive amount of people. But I mean, Hansi's just sounds incredible. Again, highly recommended.
It's funny you mentioned that. They this so you talk about wanting to have that perfect sound or that perfect setting, and they obviously toured and played this album in its entirety. I know for a fact the band has been offered to play Nightfall live in its entirety, but they don't believe that they can do it justice. And I'm to this day, that's the reason why they haven't played Nightfall live, at least in its entirety. They certainly touch the album and they play certain songs from it and continue to do so even today, but they just don't think that they can do the album justice, so they haven't done it. But this album, just because maybe it's a little bit less orchestration, maybe it's just because the songs are just a little bit easier to reproduce in a live setting. That's how they were able to pull this off and literally do an entire tour around the disc. One of the things that stood out to me, and it was, and this is kind of one of the hallmarks of the Blind Guardian sound, the acoustic guitars that are sprinkled throughout this disc on the intro to I'm Alive, A Past and Future Secret, and even in the beginning of Mordred's song, the acoustic guitars are what just set this album apart from being this thrashy speed metal disc, and really what kind of set the tone for, like you said, this transition into the future with the more orchestration and stuff. I am a sucker for those acoustic guitars.
Yeah, it kind of takes you to like this, like sitting by like a fire in the forest where the bard and an acoustic guitar playing a song. It's just very folksy, I think.
Yeah, like the minstrel is about to start playing, Mordred's song for you or something like that.
Yeah, I don't know any minstrels, but
I assume that's what it sounds like. Let's put it that way. I'll say one other thing, and I love this disc. I think that I think that I didn't do it justice for years, and I'm happy that we revisited it just because I kind of jogged my memory a bit. But there's one song in particular which is really fascinating to me, and I remember the first time that I heard it, and I hated it. I've since come around on it, but I want to talk about Bright Eyes for a second. I remember hearing this song and thinking to myself, this is a cover song. And you're probably thinking to yourself, what the hell is he talking about? If you listen to the beginning of Bright Eyes, I think about my favorite hair metal band from the 80s, which is Dokken. And you're going to say, what the hell is the connection? Dokken came out with a song called Dream Warriors. It was actually on one of the Nightmare on Elm Street soundtracks, in addition to their own, obviously their own disc in 1987. That song, Dream Warriors, is essentially the exact intro, at least to my ears, as Bright Eyes. So when I first heard Bright Eyes, I said to myself, this is a Dokken ripoff, but it's not nearly as good. And obviously it goes in its own direction later on. But if you haven't heard, if you listen to the two side by side, and I'd be hard pressed to think that you don't hear the resemblance.
yeah, good. I never really noticed, so maybe I'll have to go back and check that out.
And I'll be honest, maybe it's me, but I just, for some reason, I can't I can't distinguish the two at this point, because to me they sound so similar. But I've come around on the song, and it actually is a really, really good, power ballady song that I kind of overlooked for years because I hated it when I first heard it. But yeah, top to bottom, this album is just well worth a listen. If you had to choose your track of the week, which one are you going with?
When you told me what album we were going to talk about, I knew immediately what song I was going to pick.
No kidding.
And after listening to the album twice this week, I didn't change my mind. The script for my Requiem is not just my favorite song on this album, but it is arguably my favorite Blind Guardian song of all time. And hearing it live only cemented that choice for me. I just love it. It's just just like a phenomenal epic power metal song, and it has a lot of that early Blind Guardian speed metal guitar work in it. I mean, just I don't know, just a fantastic song to me.
It is, and so much so that it's. I think that even when they're not touring this album, every time I've seen them, they've played that song. So it's obviously even the band holds it in high regard, and certainly the fans do as well, because it's something that they always give the fans during the live set. If even if they're going to play one or two songs from Imaginations, Script for My Requiem, and probably Born in a Morning Hall as a close second. Those are the tracks that they always play from this album, and I can't really say that I don't understand why. It is that is a great tune, and it's a great live tune, like you said. It's just really really good, and with the album out now, obviously being re-released and having the live version just come out, it kind of breathed some new life into this album. It has received quite a bit of acclaim over the years. Loudwire named it the number 2 power metal disc of all time, which in and of itself should tell you something. And Rock Hard Magazine came out with a list of the 500 greatest rock and metal albums of all time, albeit from 2005. And this was ranked in the top 500 at number 373. So you know that this album received some great acclaim, both when it came out and even to this day, having been named the number 2 power metal disc of all time. Probably not my number 2 disc. In fact, I know it's not, but I can certainly understand why it received such high praise.
No doubt about it. It belongs on those lists for sure.
What do you rate this on a scale of 1 to 10?
This album is a 9.0 for me.
Wow, that you know something, I was not I was not expecting that. But you know something, I guess at this point you'd have to say has it eclipsed Nightfall as your favorite Blind Guardian disc, or are they both like 1A and 1B?
Yeah, it's just because they're very different to me. Because
Yes.
Nightfall is so much more theatrical with all of the interludes and the segues telling the story and everything. So it's not as it's a lot more, I guess, like up and down. Whereas this album is pretty much just like, let's just get it all, like let's cram.
Let's just get it out there and get it all.
Yeah, let's cram in everything in under 50 minutes, and they succeed. So they're very different albums to me. I think that Blind Guardian, their production really hit a peak, or at least like really got really good with Nightfall. This Imaginations is still a little bit more raw, I think, sounding overall than Nightfall. But in all honesty, like if I were to say like name 10 of my all-time favorite Blind Guardian songs, I'd say the majority of those 10 would come off of those 2 albums. So I don't know that I don't know if I could say I like one better than the other. It's pretty darn close.
They are very different. And like you said, this is more of just an album that you're going to sit there and enjoy everything. Whereas I think there's a little bit more to take in on an Imaginations. But having listened to this, I would have to say that if I was going to go back and listen to something, if I had an hour and I had to pick one of these albums, I think I'd probably go back to Imaginations at this point. It may have actually eclipsed Nightfall, just because it's a little bit of an easier listen without the interludes and without the spoken word tracks and stuff like that. It's something that you can listen to, play straight through, and enjoy every track. Because like you said, there's not a bad song on this disc. There's not a bad song on here. I think that if you polled a number of people, some may say that Script for My Requiem is the best track. Others may say that Another Holy War is underrated and the best track on the disc. I think that if you ask enough people, you'd get a number of different answers, but that just speaks to how good the album is from start to finish.
Can't agree more on that. I also think that the previous album, Somewhere Far Beyond, is worth mentioning as well as another really excellent Blind Guardian album. I put those 3 albums as my top 3 Blind Guardian albums.
Yeah, and it's like you said, it's interesting that they came out one after the other, within a 6-year span. To me, this is as good as it's going to get from top to bottom. It's a 9 for me as well. And the only reason I think I hold it in higher esteem than Somewhere Far Beyond is I just thought it was more balanced. Somewhere Far Beyond has some of my favorite Blind Guardian tracks on there, but I didn't think that there were any weak songs on this disc. whereas some of the stuff on Somewhere Far Beyond I thought was a little bit of filler. Not that it's bad, it just doesn't hold up to some of the even deeper cuts on this particular album. So I mean, that's a 9 from both of us. I think it's as good as it's going to get for a Blind Guardian disc, which says a lot. And I continue to look forward to hearing them do more stuff as they release, albums in the future. Because I have no reason to believe that they're done. I think that once they start touring again and once things pick up, it's going to be business as usual for them.
Absolutely, definitely.
Yeah, and then so obviously that kind of puts a bow on Imaginations. Next week we do something very, very interesting, at least to me. We're both going to talk about our best of 2020. So no album in depth next week. We're going to do a little bit of a departure, but instead we're going to talk about our favorite discs and maybe even some lowlights from 2020, which was a really, really interesting year, at least for me. And I'll tell you, I listened to a ton of new albums this year. Coming up with a list of 50 was actually really, really hard because I thought that there were a lot of good, albeit I don't think that there was anything revolutionary this year, just a lot of really good discs.
Yeah, putting this list together, I'm actually still working on mine, but it's not easy. There was just a lot of really, really strong releases that I enjoyed quite a bit. So I'll definitely be spending the next week kind of curating and finalizing my list. I'm hoping to get at least my top 25, but I guess we'll see what happens. But I could probably list 50 albums that I really enjoyed this year, but putting them in an order is really, really hard. Is. So
yeah, I don't disagree. We want to make sure, it's funny. We have, with the feedback that we've gotten, which has been fantastic, we kind of have two different camps that listen to our show. We have people that have, been really firmly entrenched in the metal world, so to speak, for years, if not decades. And they kind of get a kick out of listening to, our opinions and what we like and whether or not they agree or disagree. And then you have other people that are kind of just getting into this stuff either for the first time, or maybe they became a little disenchanted with the scene and are just coming back. And they kind of are going back to stuff that they either missed or stuff that they just never heard for one reason or another. And we're getting a lot of good feedback from them as well. Just saying, we love your deep dives into some of these albums. And then obviously next week we'll do something very different where you're going to kind of get a snippet of a lot of discs that we both heard this year and recommendations that are definitely, at least in our mind, worth checking out. So we think that'll be a nice change of pace, and then we'll head into the rest of 2021 with you picking out an album for the following week, which I look forward to.
I also think it should be interesting too, because so far I feel like our opinions on all the albums we've discussed have been fairly similar as far as like rating the albums go, and I think next week the people who listen will really get to see where you and I differ in terms of what we gravitate towards.
We talk offline, and one album which I know is going to be really, really high for you, and I'll put it out there as a spoiler. There's an album that you've been raving about pretty much since it came out earlier this year, and it's an album which I've struggled with because I've listened to it a lot, and it's just not cracking the surface for me, and it's the new Alestorm album. That's just one of the many examples without giving away too much, but I have a feeling it's going to be in your top 5, maybe your top 10. But for me, it's not even in my top 50 for the year. So I think that we're going to have some interesting conversation to take us into the new year. It'll be interesting to say the least.
Right. And we're definitely not going to discuss anything beforehand. So, I think it'll make for some really interesting conversation, and I think not prepping each other makes it all the more real, I guess, would be the best way to put it.
Sure. I like I said, that's just speculation on my part based on some of the hints that you've dropped, months ago. But we'll see when the list drop next week. For everyone that's out there, please give us a 5-star review if you think we deserve it. Feel free to interact with us on any of the social media platforms. We check that stuff on a regular basis, and we look forward to bringing you new episodes each and every week. So thank you. Have a happy, healthy new year, and we'll see you in January 2021.
Yeah, 2020 was a challenging year to say the least for pretty much everybody. So we're gonna wrap a bow on it with this Blind Guardian episode, and then when we come back, it'll be 2021. We'll talk about all the albums from 2020, which were definitely a highlight of a low year, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
And we're gonna start out fresh, and we hope to be having at least 52 new episodes for you next year and beyond. So that's our goal. And I just want to say thanks to everybody that's reached out and had positive comments. And I've personally really enjoyed doing this. It's been a highlight of the end of this year. So I just want to say thanks to you for pitching the idea to me and convincing me to do this, because this has been very, very fun for me.
Same here, bud. I look forward to doing something new next year. And obviously, if there's anything that you want to hear, hit us up, and we'll try to take requests as we get deeper into the new year. Let's put a bow on 2020 and look ahead to more exciting times.
Absolutely.
Take it easy, bud.
Take care.